I'll be talking about artificial intelligence and diagnostic medicine. So, with the rise of COVID, interaction has been limited. Also, hospitals are filling up with contagious COVID patients. Most people can't go to the hospital for regular checkups or other cases for fear of contracting COVID, like Luis mentioned at the beginning. This is where telemedicine comes in. The prefix tele, like in telephone, television, or telemarketing, means distance. Telemedicine allows doctors to practice and patients to receive healthcare from the comfort of their own homes. So, let me give you a very basic example of telemedicine. So, last summer, my mother wasn't feeling well. She was coughing and she had a runny nose and she felt feverish. We were all really worried for her, and I was going everywhere online to check if her symptoms matched those for COVID. Thankfully, we found out that she didn't have it, but of course, we took precautions just in case. So here's the program I made. What it does is it takes a list of symptoms and asks the user if they're experiencing them. So right now, I'm not experiencing any symptoms. And basically, you answer this based on your symptoms, and it will give you a diagnosis at the end. So if we take a closer look into the program, there are a lot of symptoms because it's supposed to treat 4 different diagnoses. So when I wrote these programs, I gave values to each of the symptoms and said how much they match up to the different diagnoses. These values might sound familiar. That's because they're kind of similar to the weights that you have in artificial intelligence. And this counter value at the end, it's basically like the bias. Since these values were assigned and modified by me, this sadly can't be considered AI since I programmed the whole thing. Of course, I'm not a medical professional, so I did link to an official website. So please don't call me out for that. If you look at the symptom chart that the website has, it actually shows the data for different symptoms and for different diagnoses. And if my program was able to take the raw data that made up that chart, then it could assign the weight itself, and it could assign the bias itself, and then it would be an AI, and it would also be more work for me. If I released this program, though, it could help people wondering if they have COVID and need to get it checked out. What if we expanded from just COVID to any disease or condition? Wouldn't that be useful? Right now, because of the pandemic, people can't go to the doctor to get their symptoms checked out. That's where Boy Health comes in. Basically, you chat with an AI assistant, which takes your symptoms, and it suggests the best course of action. Pretty cool, right? The Boy Health chatbot was developed by Dr. Andrew Lay and his team from Harvard Medical School, back when COVID wasn't a thing. Dr. Andrew found that people kept going online to check out their symptoms, and they ended up being wrong often. So he committed to making the healthcare system less complicated. Now, Boy Health is really useful for people who want to get some symptoms checked out but can't go to the hospital since they don't want to get COVID, or they aren't sure if their symptoms are really serious. Boy works by taking data like any AI, and they get their data from clinical trials. While in my diagnostic program, I specified which symptoms meant which conditions, Boy goes directly through thousands of clinical trials, setting its own weights and biases for each condition and symptom. While most diagnostic programs go through a decision tree or a similar thing to diagnose problems, unlike my program, this could cause problems since people could have different symptoms show up for the same condition. And if someone is experiencing something that wasn't on a branch of the decision tree, it wouldn't be taken into account on the diagnosis. Boy is programmed with people's individuals' reactions to certain conditions in mind, which allows them to cater better to their users. Like with anything, the Boy Health chatbot has its limitations. One concern that is posed often is what happens to the data once it's collected. Data privacy is a huge issue with AI, since the AI needs data to work, but people don't want to give this data for fear of it being sold. Thankfully, Boy has thought out and made sure the AI takes any proprietary health information directly without it being accessible to employees unless strictly prohibited. But there are a lot of issues with AI, right? Like what I just said, data privacy and many more. So we're gonna have a sort of discussion about different things. So the first thing I had planned was AI bias, but Miss Francesca ended up talking about all the examples I had, which is actually kind of helpful. So in the chat or in the Discord, you can discuss your feelings on what happens when our emotionless robots end up having a prejudice. For example, a self-driving car. I don't think Miss Francesca did say which talk about it, but like, what if you had a self-driving car that was driving, and there was a car and there was a person, and it had no option but to like hit it? What should the car do? I'm getting some answers in the chat. They sound pretty good. I actually have two more questions, so I'm sorry to kind of cut this a bit short. But um, our next question is, well, of course, you can still discuss this in the Discord or in the chat if you want. So the next question is algorithmic transparency. So this is a huge thing in AI right now because people like with deep learning networks or really complicated algorithms, people can't understand where the AI is coming up with its output. And this can be a problem. For example, if you have an AI that judges a worker's efficiency, like in a school, and then it recommends like firing a teacher based on like things she's done, it'll recommend you someone, but you can't figure out where they came up with that recommendation, and that's not very good because like you can't just fire someone without a reason, right? So something could also be wrong with the algorithm, and since the AI is writing it, not the programmer, the AI could be reinforcing bad behavior. There's this one more algorithm that grades papers, but this could be exploited by students if the algorithm is really transparent. And students might not write their papers for like the actual meaning, and they might just write it for the grade. So for this one, what do you think? Should we have more transparent algorithms or less transparent algorithms? You can put your answers in the chat or in the forum channel in the Discord. You could also say like we should have more transparent, but like not super transparent, or you can have various degrees of an answer. It's not like a black and white question. So I'm getting some answers that say it's like depending on the situation. So do you want to try like assign a kind of situation to the spectrum? Like, oh, it should be super transparent in cases like um, when you're like prosecuting someone. It shouldn't be that transparent when you want to like grade a student's paper or something like that. Like you can name something when would you want your algorithm to be transparent? Our last question is privacy versus surveillance, because AI needs our data, but should it get it? So you might have heard in some countries that they're doing this kind of, where they have CCTV cameras, and these like look at people and assign their faces, and it's got everybody registered. So their like justification is that you can really understand who's who, like especially in crime. If you can recognize a face based on a CCTV camera, then you can easily recognize who's the criminal, who's the victim, and like it's not a very ambiguous case. But at the same time, people are being worried for their security. Like, is it um, against privacy laws to have their face recognized wherever they go? So you guys can put your answers in the chat or in the Discord. One point that people make, if you've read 1984, I think that's the book. It's one of George Orwell's books where there's this sort of big brother government, and people are afraid that's what's going to happen to us because 1984 is dystopia, and that could be harmful. So Yeah, so for any more answers, please put them in the chat or in the Discord. And in conclusion, as we can see, artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly prevalent in our world, especially with COVID and the need for increase in technological progress. Healthcare is being transformed by artificial intelligence and simplifying the lives of many. The advent of new technologies is not always welcome, though, and we must also understand the socio-ethical impacts of artificial intelligence. Simply not understanding AI is not sustainable given AI's pervasive nature. So I hope you learned something from my presentation, and thank you for listening.